3 radar contacts. Moving fast. Too fast for fishing boats. The officer of the watch on the bridge of Pavel Derzhavin had seen strange returns before. The Black Sea was full of them. Debris from sunken hulls, flotsam from bombarded port facilities, electronic ghosts kicked up by Ukrainian jamming arrays onshore. You learned to read the sea the way a doctor reads an X-ray, looking for the anomaly that doesn't belong. These 3 contacts belonged. They were running at 37 knots in a loose wedge formation, bearing 270, closing from 11 kilometers. No AIS transponder, no radio contact, no navigation lights. The sea state was moderate. 1-meter swells rolling in off the open water to the southwest. Enough chop to scatter radar energy and complicate visual acquisition. The watch officer reached for his radio handset. His voice was calm, professionally calm. The kind of calm that comes from training, not from confidence. That calm would not last another 4 minutes. Welcome to EastAlert, where real battles get the analysis they deserve. I'm your host, and today we're reconstructing one of the most tactically significant naval engagements of the entire Black Sea campaign. A Ukrainian Magura V7 swarm strike against the Russian Project 22160 patrol corvette Pavel Derzhavin in the western approaches southwest of Sevastopol near Cape Fiolent. This is a story about innovation defeating tradition. A $37 million warship hunted by autonomous weapons that cost a fraction of a percent of its replacement value. And the moment a trained Russian naval crew realized they had been completely outsmarted. Real tactics, real consequences. EastAlert. To understand why this strike mattered, you need to understand what Pavel Derzhavin represented. Not just as a hull, but as an expression of Russian naval thinking in the Black Sea theater. The Project 22160 class was designed around a specific problem. How do you maintain persistent maritime patrol presence across a contested sea without committing your most capable platforms to routine duties? The answer was a vessel of moderate displacement, around 1,800 tons fully loaded, armed with enough defensive systems to handle the threat environment as Russian naval planners understood it when the class was conceived. 8-caliber cruise missiles in vertical launch cells, NAK-630M close-in weapon system for terminal defense, a Panzer M naval variant on more recently upgraded hulls, helicopter facilities. Sensors adequate for patrol duties in a sea where Russia expected to maintain naval supremacy. Pavel Derzhavin was not a frontline combatant in the traditional sense. It was a presence vessel, a flag-showing platform. Something to put on the radar returns of nervous merchant captains and remind them that the Black Sea was, in Russian planning documents at least, a Russian lake. The war had not gone according to those planning documents. By the time of this engagement, the Black Sea Fleet had suffered losses that would have seemed impossible to Russian admirals just a few years earlier. The cruiser Moskva had gone to the bottom. Multiple landing ships had been struck in Sevastopol harbor. A submarine had been damaged in dry dock. Russian surface combatants had been driven progressively eastward, abandoning the western basin and the supply corridors linking Sevastopol to the Crimean coastline. Every hull that retreated east reduced Russia's ability to patrol the approaches, interdict Ukrainian coastal traffic, and threaten the Odessa port infrastructure that had become Ukraine's economic lifeline. Pavel Derzhavin's patrol zone southwest of Cape Fiolent was therefore not routine. It was strategic. The corvette was covering an approach vector that Ukrainian drone motherships had been using to stage naval drone operations into the western Black Sea. Sustained patrol presence there, Russian intelligence assessed, would complicate Ukrainian launch operations significantly. What Russian intelligence had not adequately modeled was how far Ukrainian naval drone doctrine had evolved. Which element proved most decisive in this engagement? The Magura V7's explosive warhead, its electronic countermeasures package, or the saturation tactics that overwhelmed Pavel Derzhavin's close-in defense? A. The warhead alone. B. The ECM package. C. The saturation approach. Drop your answer in the comments. We'll break down the technical reality at the end of this video. The Magura V7 is not an improvised weapon. That point deserves emphasis, because the international community sometimes falls into the comfortable misconception that Ukrainian naval drones are sophisticated versions of hobbyist hardware, assembled in a garage from commercial components and sent toward the enemy with fingers crossed. The reality is a purpose-engineered maritime strike platform reflecting years of developmental iteration driven by direct operational feedback. The V7 designation marks a significant generational step from earlier Magura variants. Hull length has been extended to carry a larger fuel payload, pushing operational range beyond 800 kilometers from launch point to target. The propulsion system, a conventional water jet arrangement optimized for low acoustic signature, allows sustained speeds exceeding 35 knots with burst capability pushing toward 40. The warhead section carries 320 kilograms of high explosive, configured in a shaped charge arrangement designed to maximize below waterline penetration, punching through hull, plating at or near the waterline to flood compartments rapidly rather than producing spectacular topside damage. The navigation and terminal guidance architecture represents the most significant improvement. Earlier variants relied primarily on GPS with optical verification at terminal approach ranges. The V7 incorporates a multi-layered guidance stack, inertial navigation for long transits, satellite positioning with anti-jamming filters, and an active radar seeker in the terminal phase that allows autonomous target discrimination. The drone can be handed off between control nodes, launched from a mothership vessel at extended range, controlled via satellite relay during mid-course transit, then switched to autonomous terminal homing when it enters the target's defensive envelope. That handoff architecture was crucial to the operation against Pavel Derzhavin, and it was the capability that Russian naval planners had most severely underestimated. The operation had been weeks in the planning. Ukrainian naval intelligence, working with signals, intelligence assets, and satellite imagery analysis provided by partner nations, had built a detailed pattern-of-life assessment for Pavel Derzhavin's patrol cycle. The corvette was operating on a predictable schedule. It departed Sevastopol in the early morning hours, proceeded southwest along a standard patrol track that curved around Cape Fiolent and extended into open water before looping back north, and returned to port before dusk. The crew ran this route with the confidence of familiarity. Ukrainian planners identified 3 critical vulnerabilities in that pattern. First, the patrol route had a predictable inflection point, a location approximately 22 kilometers southwest of Cape Fiolent where the corvette always changed course, creating a predictable positioning window. Second, that inflection point sat at the edge of effective radar coverage from Russian coastal monitoring stations, meaning a surface contact approaching from the southwest under emissions control would have reduced detection probability until it was well inside the drone's attack radius. Third, the sea state at that location, generated by the prevailing southwest swell pattern, would complicate radar discrimination between genuine contacts and wave clutter at low surface grazing angles, precisely the angle from which a Magura V7 running at its operational waterline would approach. The Ukrainian plan exploited all 3 vulnerabilities simultaneously. A civilian-registered vessel operating undercover had been positioned well outside Russian-monitored waters several days prior. This mothership carried 3 Magura V7 units in a concealed deck configuration that showed nothing unusual to overhead observation. The launch window was calculated based on Pavel Derzhavin's patrol cycle, the predicted sea state, and the orbital timing of Russian space-based surveillance assets, which Ukrainian signals intelligence had been tracking with considerable precision. Stay with me, because what happens in the next section of this engagement completely dismantles the assumption that modern naval patrol vessels can defend themselves against saturated drone attacks using legacy close-in weapon doctrine. The night before the operation, a complication emerged that nearly derailed the entire plan. The satellite communications relay node designated as the primary control link for the mid-course transit phase went dark. A technical failure at the ground station level, not enemy action, but the effect was identical. The 3 drones could be launched and could execute their pre-programmed transit under inertial navigation, but the ability to make real-time course corrections during the approach was severely degraded. The terminal homing seekers would need to perform flawlessly without human operator correction during the final minutes of the run. The Ukrainian operators had a decision to make: abort and reset for a future window, potentially weeks away, given the operational security requirements for repositioning the mothership and resetting the patrol pattern analysis, or launch and trust the terminal guidance architecture to deliver the weapons to target autonomously. They launched. The 3 Magura V7 units entered the water in sequence, 45 seconds between each splash, at a point approximately 94 kilometers southwest of Pavel Derzhavin's projected position at intercept time. The launch was timed to place the drones in their terminal approach phase shortly before the corvette reached its predictable inflection point, the course change that Russian habit had made as reliable as a clock. At launch, the drones ran dark. No active emissions, no radio transmissions. The multispectral stealth coatings applied to the hull reduced radar cross-section to approximately that of a large waterbird at distances beyond 6 kilometers. The propulsion systems, running at 60% power to minimize acoustic signature, generated minimal wake in the moderate sea state. The 45-second spacing between units was deliberate. It created a staggered approach geometry that would present Pavel Derzhavin's AK-630M close-in weapon system with overlapping engagement timelines, forcing the fire control system to sequence targets rather than engaging them cleanly one at a time. This was the saturation logic at the heart of Ukrainian naval drone doctrine, refined through multiple operational cycles. You don't try to build a drone that can defeat a close-in weapon system in single combat. You build enough drones and time their arrival carefully enough that the close-in weapon system runs out of time before it runs out of ammunition. Subscribe to EastAlert if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because this kind of tactical innovation is exactly what separates the channels that analyze surface events from the ones that dig into the operational logic underneath them. Pavel Derzhavin detected the first drone contact at a range of approximately 7 kilometers. This was later than the corvette's sensors should theoretically have acquired it, given the radar specifications of systems installed on Project 22160 vessels. The sea clutter at the prevailing sea state, combined with the drone's low radar cross-section and surface grazing approach angle, had degraded detection range by an estimated 40% compared to the system's performance against conventional surface targets. 7 kilometers was not much time. The watch officer made his report. The captain was awakened. The AK-630M shifted from standby to active engagement mode. The 30mm 6-barrel Gatling-type cannon, capable of firing 5,000 rounds per minute, began tracking the contact. Then the second contact appeared, 4 kilometers further out. Then the third, 6 kilometers beyond that. The fire control officer on Pavel Derzhavin faced a scenario that Russian naval training exercises had not adequately simulated. 3 simultaneous inbound contacts at different ranges and closing velocities, all approaching from slightly different bearings, all requiring sequential engagement with a single gun system. The AK-630M could engage one target at a time. The fire control solution for the first drone, the closest, the most immediate threat, had to be completed before the system could slew to the second. It was a geometry problem, and the geometry was deliberately designed to be unsolvable. The AK-630M opened fire on the lead drone at approximately 8 kilometers range. At that distance, a round-trip radar track cycle, processing lag in the fire control system, and mechanical slew time combined to create engagement windows measured in fractions of seconds. The drone was moving at 38 knots, nearly 20 meters per second. The engagement envelope closed faster than the system's tracking cycle could compensate for, particularly in the moderate sea state that was producing false clutter hits and momentarily breaking the fire control solution. What happened next was reconstructed from satellite imagery analysis, signals intelligence, intercepts, and the physical evidence of the wreck pattern. The first drone impacted Pavel Derzhavin approximately 1 meter above the waterline on the port quarter, the stern section below and forward of the helicopter deck. The 320-kilogram shaped charge detonated against the hull plating. The penetration geometry was not perfect. The drone's final approach angle was slightly high, meaning the warhead struck above rather than at the waterline. The hull was opened, but flooding was initially limited to the after-engine room compartment. The crew responded. Damage control parties moved. The flooding rate was calculated. The ship was not immediately in danger of sinking. Then the second drone arrived. The AK-630M had been tracking it. But the first impact had disrupted the engagement. Vibration and blast overpressure had momentarily degraded the fire control radar's track solution. The gun system reacquired at 4 kilometers. In the time it took to rebuild the firing solution, the drone had closed to less than 600 meters. The burst that finally connected destroyed the guidance section of the incoming Magura but failed to kill the warhead. The drone, structurally compromised, yawed left and struck the hull in an uncontrolled manner rather than as a guided impact. But it struck nonetheless. The warhead detonated on contact with the hull plating at the waterline, precisely where the shaped charge penetrator was optimized to perform. The flooding changed character, no longer contained to the after section. The midship compartments began taking water. The list that had been barely perceptible became pronounced. The third drone was never engaged effectively, with the fire control system still recovering from the second engagement, with the ship's power distribution disrupted by flooding and damage to the electrical bus running through the affected compartments, with the crew managing cascading damage control emergencies across multiple stations simultaneously. the AK-630M was unable to establish and hold a valid track. The third Magura V7 completed its autonomous terminal guidance run without interference. It struck at the waterline directly amidships. If you believe tactics win wars, and the evidence in this Black Sea engagement is that they absolutely do, type EastAlert in the comments. Because what Ukrainian naval planners demonstrated here was doctrinal evolution in real time, not just operational success. The damage assessment compiled from satellite imagery analysis, signals intelligence, and Ukrainian general staff reporting describes a vessel pushed beyond its structural reserves faster than the crew could respond. The three impacts had distributed damage across the after third of the ship in a pattern that defeated compartmentalized flooding containment. The midship strike, the third hit, had opened flooding pathways connecting compartments designed to remain isolated. Satellite imagery captured in the hours following the engagement showed Pavel Derzhavin listing sharply to port, with the stern visibly lower in the water. Russian naval search and rescue assets departed Sevastopol and reached the scene within approximately 2.5 hours of the initial impacts. The towing operation that followed was described in intercepted communications as extremely difficult. The vessel's stability was marginal, and any towing bridle configuration that produced lateral forces risked accelerating the list. The corvette did not return to Sevastopol under its own power. Ukrainian sources reported that the vessel settled significantly during the towing attempt, with the stern awash before rescue tugs could establish a stable tow, the precise endpoint of the engagement. Whether Pavel Derzhavin was eventually brought into port for damage assessment or lost during the towing operation remained subject to competing claims. What was not in dispute, based on satellite imagery and signals intelligence corroboration, was the scale of the damage and the operational elimination of the vessel from active patrol duty for the foreseeable future. Crew casualties were reported by Ukrainian sources as significant, though precise figures remained unconfirmed. Russian official communications made no announcement of the engagement, standard practice for losses that contradict the official narrative of Black Sea Fleet operational integrity. Intercepted internal communications, referenced in reporting by Ukrainian naval intelligence and corroborated by OSINT analysts tracking radio traffic from Sevastopol, described multiple killed and wounded from the initial impacts and the rapid flooding that followed. The numbers ranged from 8 to 23 casualties across the three strikes, a range reflecting genuine uncertainty in Ukrainian intelligence about the specifics of the damage control situation before communications with the vessel degraded. What would NATO doctrine have done differently in this same engagement scenario, both in the attack and in the defense? Drop your tactical analysis in the comments. We read every one. The Russian Naval Command's response to the engagement revealed the strategic stakes more clearly than any official statement could. Within 48 hours of the attack on Pavel Derzhavin, satellite imagery showed increased activity at the Novorossiysk naval base, some 200 kilometers to the east. Vessels that had been positioned in the western approaches were observed moving toward the more defensible eastern basin. The patrol pattern that Pavel Derzhavin had been executing, the southwestern sweep around Cape Fiolent, was not resumed by any replacement vessel. The western approaches to Sevastopol, which Russian naval planners had maintained at significant cost, were effectively conceded. This matters for the larger strategic picture. The Black Sea Fleet's value to Russia's war effort depends on its ability to threaten Ukrainian coastal infrastructure, complicate maritime logistics to Odessa, and demonstrate that Russia retains the capacity to contest the sea. Every hull driven from the western basin reduces all three capabilities simultaneously. The loss of patrol coverage southwest of Cape Fiolent meant Ukrainian maritime drone motherships could operate with greater freedom in a zone that had previously been contested. The supply lanes reaching Crimea from the east became more critical, precisely as the western alternatives became less defensible. From a tactical lessons perspective, the Magura V7 strike against Pavel Derzhavin produced several conclusions that Ukrainian planners and Western naval analysts were already incorporating into doctrine. The saturation geometry employed against the AK-630M validated the fundamental logic of multi-drone swarm tactics against single-point close-in defense systems. A close-in weapon system designed to handle single targets or a very small number of simultaneous inbound threats cannot perform adequately against staggered, multi-bearing drone attacks when the timing intervals between arrivals are compressed below the system's engagement-re-engagement cycle time. This had been modeled theoretically in naval warfare analysis for decades. The engagement against Pavel Derzhavin demonstrated it operationally, in real sea state, against a real system with trained operators under actual combat conditions. The handoff architecture. The ability to launch from a distant mothership, transit under autonomous guidance when communications links degraded, and complete the terminal attack under onboard seeker authority proved that Ukrainian naval drone capability had reached a level of operational independence that reduced dependency on persistent communications links. The near failure that had seemed likely when the satellite relay node went dark did not, in the end, compromise the operation. The terminal guidance seekers performed as designed. Russian close-in defense doctrine, as instantiated on Project 22160 class vessels, was revealed as inadequate against the evolved Magura V7 threat. The AK-630M is a formidable system within its designed engagement parameters. Those parameters were built around a threat model, primarily incoming missiles and high-speed aircraft, that did not fully anticipate the specific characteristics of a saturated surface drone attack. The relatively slow speed of the Magura compared to an anti-ship missile, which might have seemed to favor the defense, was more than offset by the saturation timing, the low radar cross-section, the sea clutter environment, and the staggered multi-bearing approach geometry. The intelligence discipline behind the operation deserves equal recognition alongside the technical achievement. Weeks of patient pattern-of-life analysis, precise calculation of the detection window based on coastal radar coverage geometry, timing the operation to the patrol cycle with enough precision to place the drones in terminal approach exactly when and where the corvette's predictability made it most vulnerable. This was not a lucky strike. It was the product of sustained intelligence work and operational planning executed at a level of professional sophistication that continues to surprise analysts who underestimated Ukrainian military institutional development. Will Ukrainian naval drone doctrine continue to evolve faster than Russian naval defense systems can adapt? Comment yes or no. Because the evidence from this engagement suggests the trajectory is clear, but the countermeasures are coming. There is a human dimension to this engagement that the tactical analysis cannot fully capture, but that this channel will not ignore. Aboard Pavel Derzhavin, when those 3 radar contacts resolved from ambiguous returns into recognizable inbound threats, there were sailors performing their duties. Some had been at sea long enough to know what the Magura V7 designation meant. Others were young conscripts for whom the abstract threat of Ukrainian naval drones had been, until that moment, something briefed in orientation sessions and filed away in the category of things that happened to other ships. In the minutes between detection and impact, every man aboard who understood what he was seeing was living through the recognition that the ship's defensive systems might not be adequate. The first impact changed the sound of the ship. Anyone who has served at sea knows that a vessel has a sound signature. The particular rhythm of its machinery, the harmonics of its hull moving through water, the background noise that becomes so familiar it disappears from conscious awareness. When an explosion changes that sound, every sailor feels it before they understand it. Then the second impact. Then the third. The crew of Pavel Derzhavin did what naval crews do. They fought their ship. They ran toward flooding compartments. They secured hatches. They rigged pumps. They reported to damage control stations. This was not cowardice that defeated them, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. What defeated them was a system of systems. A weapon designed by people who had studied their defenses carefully and found the mathematical gap between what the AK-630M could handle and what 3 simultaneous terminal attacks would actually demand of it. The gap was exactly 320 kilograms of high explosive delivered 3 times. The operational conclusions are being studied by naval establishments across multiple countries. For Ukraine, the engagement validated the investment in Magura V7 development and demonstrated that the doctrinal framework of saturation attack against single-point defenses is operationally sound at the tactical level. For Russia, it exposed a fundamental mismatch between the threat model that Project 22160 class vessels were designed to counter and the actual threat that Ukrainian naval innovation has produced. For Western navies, it added an important data point to the growing literature on unmanned surface vehicle tactics. Specifically, the validation that autonomous terminal guidance combined with saturation approach geometry can defeat close-in weapon systems that were not designed with this threat model in mind. The waters southwest of Cape Fiolent are quieter now than they were during Pavel Derzhavin's patrol cycle. No Project 22160 hull has resumed that route. The Russian naval presence that once made those waters contested has retreated to more defensible positions, leaving the western approaches open in a way that Ukrainian maritime planners are already exploiting for subsequent operations. The wrecks and the damage tell the story more honestly than any official communiqué. The Black Sea Fleet that was supposed to demonstrate Russian power across its namesake sea has been driven to the eastern margins of that sea by a force that technically doesn't exist in the conventional sense. No surface combatants, no destroyers, no cruisers. Just determined engineers, patient intelligence analysts, experienced operators, and a weapon system that cost a tiny fraction of what it destroyed. Modern warfare punishes tactical overconfidence with a precision that earlier eras of naval combat could not deliver. Pavel Derzhavin was a capable vessel with trained personnel and functioning defensive systems. It was defeated not because those systems failed in a technical sense, but because the Ukrainian strike was designed specifically to exceed their capacity, to present a problem that the ship's defenses were constitutionally unable to solve, given the geometry, the timing, and the numbers. That is what Ukraine's naval drone force has built. Not a navy in the conventional sense. A problem generator. A system for creating tactical situations that Russian defensive doctrine cannot resolve. Now to the answer you've been waiting for. The quiz from earlier in this analysis. Which element proved most decisive in the Magura V7 engagement against Pavel Derzhavin? The warhead, the ECM package, or the saturation approach? The answer is C, the saturation approach. And here's why that answer matters more than it might initially appear. The warhead on each individual Magura V7 is a serious weapon. 320 kilograms of shaped charge, explosive, optimized for below waterline penetration, will cause significant damage to any vessel in this displacement class. But a single warhead, even optimally delivered, might not have been sufficient to overcome Pavel Derzhavin's damage control capability. Russian Project 22160 vessels are designed with compartmentalized flooding containment specifically to handle single-hit damage scenarios. The ECM package, the electronic countermeasures and low observability features of the V7, was important in degrading early detection and complicating the fire control solution. Without it, engagement at greater ranges might have allowed the AK-630M to solve the targeting problem before the geometry became unsolvable. So the ECM contribution was real and significant. But the decision that made the outcome mathematically inevitable was the saturation geometry. 3 drones, staggered in timing by 45 seconds, approaching from slightly different bearings, created a sequential engagement demand that exceeded the AK-630M's engagement re-engagement cycle time. The fire control system was forced to solve Target 1 before it could engage Target 2. The time consumed engaging Targets 1 and 2 meant that Target 3 arrived inside the minimum engagement range before the system could reacquire. Once that geometry was set, the outcome was determined not by crew performance or equipment reliability, but by arithmetic. This is the tactical insight the engagement against Pavel Derzhavin contributed to naval warfare doctrine. Saturation is not just a quantitative concept. It is a temporal and geometric one. You don't need 1,000 drones to saturate a close-in weapon system. You need enough drones, timed precisely enough, approaching from enough different bearings to push the sequential engagement demand past the system's cycle time. Against the AK-630M installation on Pavel Derzhavin, 3 units, timed correctly, was enough. 3 tactical questions worth sitting with before you move on. Was the decision to launch despite the degraded satellite communications link the right call? The operation succeeded, but it succeeded on the strength of the autonomous terminal guidance performing correctly. If the seekers had failed to discriminate correctly in the sea clutter environment, the same decision would look catastrophically wrong in retrospect. The question of when to accept operational risk by trusting autonomous systems over human operator control is one that military planners across multiple domains are wrestling with. And the Magura V7 engagement provides a specific data point, but not a universal answer. Could Pavel Derzhavin have survived if the crew had detected the drones earlier? The analysis suggests that earlier detection would have provided more engagement time for the AK-630M, potentially improving the probability of defeating the first and second drones. But the saturation geometry was designed with margin. The 45-second spacing was calculated to be effective even with earlier detection, because the re-engagement cycle time is a physical constraint of the system, not a function of how much warning time the crew has. Longer warning time helps, but the mathematics of 3 simultaneous inbound contacts against a single gun system remains challenging, regardless of when detection occurs. What would you have done differently? If you were the Ukrainian planning team, faced with the degraded communications link on the night before the operation, with weeks of intelligence work invested, and a targeting window that might not recur for months, would you have launched or aborted? There's no clean answer. Comment your reasoning. The argument for aborting is the one that says autonomous systems should not be trusted with live strike decisions when human oversight is degraded. The argument for launching is the one that says you accept operational risk when the intelligence preparation is sound, and the alternative is forfeiting an opportunity that costs significant resources to create. The crew of Pavel Derzhavin paid the price for the gap between those two arguments. Subscribe to EastAlert, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades, the engagements where doctrine met reality, where assumptions met evidence, and where the outcome redraws the map of what is possible in modern warfare. The waters off Cape Fiolent are quiet now. The patrol route that Russian naval planners believed would secure the western approaches is unoccupied. Somewhere beneath the surface, or listing in a Sevastopol dry dock that satellite imagery and OSINT analysts have been watching carefully, the hull of Pavel Derzhavin remains. A $37 million lesson in the mathematics of saturation warfare. Real tactics, real consequences. EastAlert. Stay vigilant.